If you love me, never go into the cellar. Those were the last words my husband spoke to me with any strength left in his voice. His hand, once so steady, trembled against the hospital blanket. His eyes, pale and restless, didn't look at me. Not really. They looked through me, past me, down into some place I could not see. I should have been clinging to every breath, savoring the final moments of a life we'd shared for more than 40 years. Instead, I was left reeling by that single command, sharp and strange as broken glass. The room smelled of disinfectant, sharp and bitter, and the beeping machine slowed as his chest sank lower and lower into the mattress. I wanted to take comfort from his words, something tender, something like, "I love you," or "You'll be all right." Instead, I was left with a riddle, a warning, a boundary drawn too late, too final. I nodded, because what else could I do? A wife does not argue with a dying man. A wife does not ask why, not in the last breath. My lips formed the word yes, though my heart stumbled on it. I kissed his forehead, felt the clammy sweat on his skin, and whispered that I would honor his wish. He exhaled one last rattled sigh, and then there was nothing left to answer to. The man I had cooked for, cared for, argued with, and leaned on for nearly all of my adult life was gone. But his words remained. All that day, through the blur of phone calls and paperwork, I kept hearing them. Never go into the cellar. Not take care of yourself. Not the children will look after you. Not I'll be waiting. Just the cellar. Always the cellar. It was not the first time he had spoken of it. For years, he'd been possessive of that part of the house. The old Victorian we bought when we were newlyweds had plenty of corners. Attic, pantry, garage, but only the cellar had been locked. I asked once or twice in the early days what he kept there. Tools? Paint cans? He brushed me off with a laugh and a wave of his hand. Nothing for you to fuss about, just man's work. It was the sort of answer I learned not to challenge. He liked to keep some things his own, and I, eager to keep the peace, let it go. Yet now, his final breath had turned that old locked door into something else. Not just a storage space, but a forbidden chamber. A place tied to love itself, because he'd said it that way. If you love me, never go in. As if my loyalty, my devotion, my very identity as his wife were bound forever to the latch and the steps below. That night, after the undertakers left and the house settled into its lonely creaks, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the cellar door. The lock was plain brass, scuffed from years of use. I'd walked past it 1,000 times with laundry baskets and grocery bags, never thinking twice. But now it throbbed in my vision like a heartbeat. I imagined the steps descending into darkness, the smell of damp earth, the echo of my own footsteps on. Concrete. What could possibly be so terrible or so precious that he would tether it to my love for him? Grief and shock dulled everything else. The sympathy calls, the neighbor who brought over a casserole, even the silence of our empty bed. But the cellar pulsed in my mind. His voice, thin and cracked, replayed itself as if the walls themselves were whispering. Never go into the cellar. I sat there until the clock struck midnight, my hands cold around a mug of tea I never drank. And in that silence, one truth pressed itself against my chest. His last gift to me had not been comfort nor assurance, but a burden. A locked room and a command. I told myself I would honor it. I told myself love meant obedience, even beyond the grave. But a part of me, the part that still burned with the quiet rebellions I had learned to swallow over the years, ached to know, to step down the forbidden stairs and face whatever he had hidden from me all that time. For now, though, I said nothing. I simply stared at the cellar door until my eyes blurred with tears, and I let the promise sit heavy on my tongue. Silence was my only answer. I should begin with who I am, though sometimes I wonder if I even know anymore. My name has been spoken mostly as wife, mother, or grandma for most of my life. My own first name feels like a coat I stopped wearing decades ago, folded away in a cedar chest, smelling faintly of mothballs. I am 68 years old, born in a town so small you could hear the church bells from every porch. I married at 20, fresh out of nursing school, when I still believed that devotion was enough to guarantee happiness. My husband was handsome then, broad-shouldered, quick-witted, and just mysterious enough to make me feel like I'd stumbled into something larger than myself. He told me he wanted to give me a good life, and I believed him with all the faith of a girl raised to honor her vows before God and family. We bought the house, had the children, and settled into the rhythm of marriage. I let go of nursing when the first baby came, convinced by his reasoning that one steady paycheck was better than 2 distracted ones. The children need their mother at home, he said, and I wanted to be needed. I spent years elbow-deep in laundry, soup pots, and scraped knees. While he built his career, I built everything else. Birthdays, Christmas mornings, school recitals, scraped car fenders, aging parents. I carried it all on my back, quiet and constant. He rewarded me in small ways. A necklace one year, a weekend trip another. But often there were slights tucked in between. I remember once at a dinner party he told our friends, "Oh, she doesn't worry herself with money matters. I keep all that straight for us." Everyone laughed politely while my cheeks burned. Another time, I asked about the cellar, only half serious, and he chuckled in front of the children. "Your mother's curious as a cat, but some places are better left to men's business." The kids giggled. I smiled tightly, and then I let it slide. I always let it slide. That became the rhythm of my life, him holding the keys, literally and otherwise, while I contented myself with the garden, the recipes, the grandchildren. I told myself this was partnership, that sacrifice was love, that humility was virtue. I was the glue that held the family together, even if my own edges were never seen. Yet every now and then, there was a flicker. When the children grew up and left, I thought of going back to work, perhaps in a small clinic or retirement home. He shook his head firmly. At our age? No need. I'll provide. And again, I silenced the voice inside me that whispered I had more to give. He liked control over the bills, the accounts, the repairs. He said it was simpler if he handled things. And perhaps it was. But over the years, those small dismissals stacked up like bricks, building a wall between us that I didn't notice until it was too high to climb. The cellar became a symbol of that wall, always locked, always his domain. He went down there occasionally, carrying boxes or tools, coming back up with dust on his hands. I never asked again. My job was to keep the upstairs world clean, warm, and welcoming. His job, I told myself, was the darker, heavier things. That was how we survived, wasn't it? By dividing roles and sticking to them. I played my part so well that sometimes I didn't see how small I had become inside it. I was proud of being dependable, of being the one everyone turned to. But there were nights, quiet nights after the dishes were done, when I would sit with a cup of tea and feel invisible. And yet, I loved him. I loved the man he had been, the one who held my hand through the births of our children, who fixed the squeak in the stair before Christmas morning, who built a life we could lean on. I loved him enough to forgive the sharp edges, the dismissive words, the way he guarded secrets like they were gold. That's why his final words struck me so deep. They weren't just about a door. They were about a lifetime of being told what I could and could not touch, what I could and could not know. His death should have set me free, yet in that last request, he bound me tighter than ever. For days after the funeral, I clung to my routines like a lifeline, polishing silver that no one would use, folding laundry for one, writing thank you notes with shaking hands. But every task carried the echo of those years, my sacrifices, my silence, my steady endurance, and every echo led me back to that locked cellar door. It stood there at the bottom of the hallway, ordinary and unyielding, as if daring me to measure my life by what I had given up and what had been kept from me. The house was too quiet after the funeral. Grief has a sound, an odd one. It is not silence, but a hollow hum, like a refrigerator running in an empty kitchen. It filled the rooms as I moved, from chair to chair, folding and refolding the same blanket. I thought keeping busy would soothe me, but the truth was I was circling the house like a ghost, unsettled, restless, and every circle brought me past the cellar door. At first, I obeyed. I told myself love meant restraint, that my promise was still fresh, barely a week old. I made tea, I watered the plants, I called the children to assure them I was managing. But each time I passed that brass lock, something in me snagged. It wasn't grief pulling me down those stairs. It was something sharper, suspicion. One afternoon, while sorting through his desk, I found it. Tucked beneath insurance forms and unpaid bills in a folder marked Receipts, lay a small envelope. Inside was a brass key, worn around the edges, the same shape and size I had seen dangling from his keyring for years. My hands trembled as I held it, but not from surprise. A part of me had known all along that this day would come. I closed the drawer, sat at the desk, and stared at that key in my palm. His voice came back to me, weak and urgent. "If you love me, never go into the cellar." But love had already been betrayed, hadn't it? Because the moment I turned over the first stack of papers in that folder, I saw ledgers I'd never known existed. Accounts with my name nowhere on them, withdrawals, loans, checks written to names I didn't recognize, and tucked between the pages, letters, some official, others more personal. Letters that spoke of debts, arrangements, obligations stretching back years. The neat world I thought we'd built together cracked. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might faint, but a strange calm settled over me. I stood, key in hand, and walked down the hallway. Each step toward the cellar door felt like a step toward the truth I had avoided for decades. My hand shook as I slid the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, almost eagerly, as though the house itself had been waiting for this moment. The door opened with a groan and the smell hit me first, must and damp, but underneath it, paper and mildew, the scent of things hidden too long. I flicked the light, a single bulb dangling from a cord, and the stairs stretched down before me like the throat of some beast. I descended slowly, one hand on the rail, the other clutching the key like a talisman. Each creak of the wood beneath my feet sounded like an accusation. At the bottom, I stopped cold. The cellar wasn't just a storage space. It was an archive, a shrine, a vault of secrets. Cardboard boxes lined the walls, neatly labeled. Filing cabinets stood against the far end, drawers locked but not impenetrable. And on a wooden table sat stacks of notebooks, bound in leather, filled with my husband's handwriting. I reached for the top one, my hands unsteady, and opened it. Numbers, dates, names, transactions recorded with meticulous care. Some names I recognized, old neighbors, colleagues of his from work. Others were strangers. But what chilled me was seeing my own pension listed. Withdrawals marked in his hand, money funneled into accounts I never knew existed. The second notebook held letters. Some were from banks, some from lawyers, but others were personal, handwritten by people I had never met. A woman thanking him for his generosity. A young man asking when he might expect another installment. My stomach turned. He had not been providing only for us. He had been living a double life, moving money in and out, keeping accounts in secret while I tightened the budget upstairs, reusing foil, patching old sweaters, making meals stretch. It was as though I had been married to a stranger. I sank into the rickety chair by the table, notebook open in my lap. My hands shook so badly I could hardly hold the pages. My mind raced back through the years to every time he'd told me, "Don't worry yourself, I've got it handled." to every time he had laughed off my curiosity about the cellar, the bills, the accounts. It had not been love that made him guard these secrets. It had been betrayal. Tears blurred the words, but I forced myself to keep reading, page after page, until the truth was undeniable. The man I had trusted, the man I had built a life beside, had kept me in the dark deliberately. He had stolen from me, lied to me, and hidden it beneath our own home. The cellar was no place of mystery. It was a monument to deception. When I climbed the stairs again, the air upstairs felt different, thinner somehow, as though the walls themselves knew I had crossed into forbidden ground. I closed the cellar door and turned the lock, but nothing could lock away what I had seen. I pressed my forehead to the wood and whispered, "I know." And in that moment, the denial I had clung to for decades shattered. The truth was out, heavy and raw. Whatever love I thought his last words carried, it was no longer enough to keep me blind. The days that followed blurred together like watercolor bleeding across a page. I went through the motions of life, waking, making coffee, washing the same cup, sitting at the table, but none of it felt real. The cellar pressed against my mind like a bruise. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those ledgers, the neat handwriting that had chronicled a life I never knew existed. Grief had been my companion already, but now it had a twin, humiliation. Grief I could have borne. I had expected grief, prepared for it in the way all wives must eventually prepare, but humiliation. That struck deeper, twisting the knife in ways no widow is warned about. I thought about the casseroles neighbors had brought, the kind smiles, the words of comfort. He adored you. What a faithful husband he was. I'd nodded politely, accepting condolences I no longer believed. Every kindness felt like a cruel joke, because I alone knew the truth hiding below my own feet. The children called when they could. My daughter in Boston asked if I was eating well. My son, busy with his work, reassured me that he would visit soon. Their voices were distracted, full of their own lives. They had no idea what I had found, and I couldn't bring myself to tell them. What good would it do to tarnish their father's memory in their eyes? So I carried it alone, the secret and the shame. The isolation grew heavier each day. I avoided the cellar, yet every step in the house seemed to echo its presence. I dreamed of it at night, doors opening, shadows spilling out, his voice whispering from the bottom of the stairs. I woke clammy and trembling, my chest tight. One evening, after a call from my son ended with, "You'll be all right, Mom. Just don't overthink things." I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the cold remains of my supper. Don't overthink. That had been the chorus of my life, hadn't it? Don't overthink when he laughed at me in front of others. Don't overthink when he brushed off my questions about money. Don't overthink when he guarded that cellar as though it were the crown jewels. But overthinking was all I had now. I reached for one of the notebooks I had carried upstairs and placed it on the table. The cover was stiff, the pages worn soft with use. His handwriting stared back at me, confident, unapologetic. It was like hearing his voice without the man himself. I ran my fingers across the ink, part of me wanting to rip the pages to shreds, another part clinging to them as the only truth left. For a long time, I sat in the silence, the humiliation pressing so heavy I could hardly breathe. I thought about how small I had let myself become, about the years I had spent smoothing over his sharp words, laughing at his jokes at my expense, silencing the questions that rose in my throat. And for what? For loyalty? For the illusion of security? I cried that night, harder than I had at the funeral. Not for the man I had lost, but for the woman I had abandoned, the girl who had once dreamed of nursing, of helping, of standing on her own 2 feet. I wept for her until there were no tears left, only a hollow exhaustion. But somewhere in that hollow space, a seed of something else took root. I realized that I had been living as though my worth depended on silence, as though my strength was measured only by endurance. But what had endurance given me? A locked door, a lifetime of unanswered questions, a final command that felt less like love and more like chains. I looked at the notebook again, the numbers and names, the evidence of betrayal laid bare, and I thought, enough. I am 68 years old. I have buried parents, raised children, survived illness and hardship. Why should I cower now in the face of a man who no longer has the power to silence me? The thought was small at first, fragile as a candle flame, but it grew. That night I closed the notebook with steady hands. I wiped my eyes, washed the dishes, and looked at my reflection in the kitchen window. The woman staring back at me was not weak. She was older, yes, lined and graying, but she was still here, still breathing, still capable of more than obedience. Grief had nearly drowned me, but humiliation had lit a fire. I would not remain small any longer. Resolve is a quiet thing. It doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It slips in slowly like dawn, and only when the light fills the room do you realize the dark has gone. After the night I wept myself dry, I woke with a kind of clarity. I didn't know yet what I would do, but I knew I couldn't go on pretending. I had just begun sorting through more of the papers from the cellar when the knock came at the door. Sharp, insistent, the kind of knock that demands rather than asks. When I opened it, my husband's younger brother, Edward, stood there. He hadn't come to the funeral to busy with business, as he put it in his brief phone call. Now here he was, well-groomed, cologne sharp in the morning air, holding a folder under his arm. His smile was thin, practiced. "Thought I'd stop by," he said, brushing past me into the hall without waiting for an invitation. "Help you get your affairs in order. These things can be overwhelming for a woman alone." That last phrase curled like smoke around my ears. A woman alone. Edward had always been like this, patronizing, sly. When we were younger, he had made little jokes at my expense, teasing me for not understanding business talk, offering mock applause when I cooked something particularly good, as if I were a child showing off. My husband laughed along, and I swallowed the humiliation. But now, standing in my hallway with that same smirk, Edward seemed larger, bolder, his confidence fed by my husband's absence. He set the folder on the table and opened it with a flourish. "Now, Margaret," he began, using my name like a teacher addressing a slow pupil, "there are some legal matters we ought to take care of. Deeds, accounts, that sort of thing. Best to sign quickly before things get complicated." I sat across from him, folding my hands to keep them from trembling. Inside the folder were papers filled with legal jargon, dense paragraphs, and signature lines marked with sticky tabs. He slid a pen toward me as if it were already decided. "Edward," I said carefully, "what exactly are these?" "Oh, nothing to trouble yourself over, just transfers, consolidations. I'll manage the estate, free you of all the fuss. You'll get a comfortable allowance, of course." He smiled as if he were offering me a kindness. Allowance. The word rang in my ears. My husband had kept me in ignorance all these years, and now his brother wanted to keep me in dependency. The same cage, painted a different color. I kept my face calm, though inside I felt the heat rising. "I think I'll need time to read these over." His smile tightened. "Time is the one thing you don't have, Margaret. Banks, creditors, taxes, they won't wait for your tea and biscuits. Best to trust me. You know I've always looked out for family." I thought of the cellar then, of the rows of ledgers and the debts my husband had left behind. Family had not been his first concern. Not me, not the children. And now Edward's sudden eagerness to manage everything felt less like care and more like a vulture circling. "I'll still read them," I said quietly. His expression hardened. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Don't make this difficult. You're not equipped for this. It's men's work, Margaret. Always has been." The words pierced me, echoing my husband's old refrain. Men's work. The same excuse that had locked me out of the cellar for decades. My chest burned, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I smiled thinly. I'll let you know once I've had them looked over. For a moment, his jaw tightened. I could see the flash of temper beneath his polished exterior. But then he snapped the folder shut, stood, and gave me that same rehearsed smile. Very well, but don't delay. You'll thank me later. After he left, the house seemed smaller, the air heavier. I sat with the papers, reading line after line of legalese I barely understood. My pulse thudded in my ears. If I did nothing, I knew exactly how this would end. Edward would take control, and I would be reduced to a dependent widow, living off whatever scraps he deemed fit to give me. The cellar had shown me the truth of my husband's betrayals. Edward had just shown me what was at stake if I didn't act. For the first time in years, I felt something sharp and alive stir in me. Anger, yes, but also resolve. I might not understand all the words on those pages, but I could learn. I could ask. I could prepare. The men in my life had mistaken my silence for ignorance. They thought my age made me weak, but they had forgotten something important. I had endured more than they could imagine. Endurance is not weakness. It is the soil in which resolve takes root, and Edward had just watered it. I sat at the kitchen table long after Edward left, the folder of documents glaring at me from across the wood grain. His pen still rested there, angled neatly where he'd left it, as though the house itself expected me to sign. For a moment, I felt the old familiar tug of obedience, the instinct to give in and let someone else handle the difficult things. But then I thought of the cellar, of the ledgers and notebooks stacked high, proof of years I'd lived in ignorance. No more. The first step was simple. I packed the folder into a canvas tote bag and took it upstairs, sliding it beneath the bed. It would not sit out on the table, silently accusing me. Out of sight, it became a task to face rather than a command to obey. The next morning, I dressed not in my usual cardigan and house shoes, but in a pressed blouse, slacks, and my best leather flats. I even dabbed on lipstick, the shade I used to wear when I was young and going into town. It felt like donning armor. I walked to the bus stop, tote bag on my shoulder, and made my way downtown. My first destination was the library. The smell of old paper and polish met me like an old friend, and for the first time in days, I felt steadied. I found a quiet corner and stacked the legal dictionaries and guide to estate law books around me like fortifications. I read slowly, tracing the unfamiliar terms with my finger, whispering them under my breath until they stuck. It was tedious, yes, but not impossible. Hours slipped by, and with them, the fog of helplessness began to thin. I wrote notes in a small spiral pad, neat rows of words: executor, probate, transfer of deed, joint tenancy. The language was foreign, but I would learn it the way I had once learned lullabies for my children, by repetition, by necessity. On the second day, I took the bus again, but this time to a law office. The brass plaque outside the door read, Margaret Huang, attorney at law. I had chosen her deliberately, someone who, like me, bore the weight of being underestimated. She was younger than I expected, sharp-eyed, her desk piled with neat stacks of files. "How can I help you, Mrs. Whitaker?" she asked kindly, offering me a seat. I pulled the folder from my tote and set it on her desk. "I need someone to explain these. And," I paused, meeting her gaze squarely, "I need someone to make sure I'm not being taken for a fool." She flipped through the pages, her brow tightening. "Who gave you these?" "My brother-in-law," I said simply. Her eyes met mine, steady and grave. "Then you did the right thing, bringing them here." For the next hour, she walked me through line by line. The documents were, in plain words, an attempt to transfer ownership of the house and most of the remaining assets into Edward's name, leaving me with little more than a monthly stipend. "It's dressed up to look legitimate," she said, tapping her pen against the signature line, "but it's exploitation, plain and simple. Don't sign anything. I'll draft a formal response." Relief washed through me, but so did anger. Anger at Edward, yes, but also at the years I had allowed myself to be kept ignorant. I want to learn everything, I told her. Not just this. I want to know what he, my husband, left behind. She nodded, her eyes softening. Then we'll do it together. Bring me everything you have. And so I did. Each day that week, I hauled another box from the cellar into her office. We sifted through ledgers, letters, and accounts. She explained the debts, the hidden accounts, the obligations I never knew existed. Some were salvageable, others not. But piece by piece, the puzzle of my husband's secret life came into focus. At night, back in my kitchen, I spread copies across the table, my notes filling the spiral pad. The woman who had once believed she wasn't equipped for men's work now sat surrounded by balance sheets, contracts, and legal codes. I wasn't just surviving, I was preparing. I also confided in a trusted friend, Helen, a widow from church who had weathered her own storms. She listened without judgment, her hands warm around mine. "You're stronger than you think," she said softly. "You always have been." Her faith in me steadied my resolve even further. Meanwhile, Edward called twice, each time pressing in that same syrupy voice. "Have you signed yet, Margaret? Time's wasting." I responded politely, offering no details. Let him think me slow, dithering, weak. The less he suspected, the better. In truth, I was laying bricks under his feet, building a trap he wouldn't see until it snapped shut. It felt strange, almost exhilarating, to keep secrets of my own. For decades, I had been the one kept in the dark. Now I was the one with knowledge tucked close to my chest, the one preparing quietly while my opponent strutted blind. By the week's end, my spiral pad was filled, the folders at Margaret Huang's office neatly labeled, and my heart steadier than it had been in years. The woman I once was, the one who sat silent while others laughed at her expense, was gone. When Edward knocked again, I would be ready. The knock came again, sharp and commanding, a week to the day since Edward first laid his folder on my table. I had been expecting it. I opened the door to find him standing there in his tailored coat, the same smug tilt to his chin. His smile barely concealed his impatience. "Margaret," he said, sweeping into the hallway without waiting, "I do hope you've come to your senses. I've brought a fresh set of papers, simplified this time, less to confuse you." I led him into the kitchen where the table was already set, but not with tea or cake as he might have expected. No, spread across the table were neat stacks of copies, highlighted lines, sticky notes marking pages. My spiral notebook lay open, my handwriting filling every page. Edward stopped mid-step, his eyes narrowing. "What's all this?" "Clarity," I said, my voice steady. "I've spent the week learning." He gave a short laugh. "Learning? Margaret, don't tell me you've been wasting your time with this nonsense. Numbers, contracts, this isn't your world. You'll only tire yourself." I folded my hands in front of me. "I may tire, but I am not blind. I know exactly what those papers are. I know they would hand you this house, the accounts, and leave me dependent on whatever allowance you decided was fitting." His smile flickered, then hardened. "Allowance is generous. You wouldn't have to worry about a thing. Isn't that what you've always wanted? To be cared for?" I leaned forward. "No, Edward. What I always wanted was honesty. What I wanted was respect. But what I got, from both my husband and from you, was secrecy and arrogance." He bristled, his voice sharpening. "Watch your tone. I'm offering to protect you from a mess you can't even begin to understand. Do you know how much debt your dear husband left? Do you know what the banks will do when they come calling?" "Yes," I said firmly, sliding a folder across the table. "I do, because I've read every page of his ledgers, every withdrawal, every debt, every lie he tucked away down in that cellar. I know where the money went. I know whose names are on the checks, and I know the law well enough now to understand exactly what rights I have. and what rights you don't. His face paled for a moment before flushing red. "Who's been filling your head with this nonsense?" I allowed myself a small smile. "An attorney. A very good one. She'll be contacting you, in fact, with a formal notice. You'll find that your schemes fall apart rather quickly under legal light." He slammed his palm against the table, rattling the stacks of paper. "You think you're clever, do you? You think you can outmaneuver me at your age? Don't be foolish, Margaret. You've always been soft, too trusting. That's why you need men like me to look after you." I met his glare with calm. "At my age, Edward, I've buried parents, raised children, and cared for a dying husband. I know patience and I know endurance. Those aren't weaknesses. They are weapons, and they've given me the strength to see through you." He sputtered, his voice rising. "This is madness. You'll regret this. You'll drown in debt without my help." I rose from my chair, standing taller than I had in years. "I would rather drown on my own terms than live on the scraps of your control. You came into my house certain I was weak, but weakness is what you see when a woman doesn't fight back. Look again, Edward. Do I look weak now?" For a moment, the room was silent but for the sound of his quickened breathing. His eyes darted over the papers, the highlighted lines, the evidence stacked like a fortress around me. Finally, I delivered the final blow. "You once laughed that I didn't understand men's work, but it turns out men's work is nothing but paper and lies. And lies, Edward, are easier to unravel than you think." His mouth opened, then closed again, no words forming. The smugness had drained from his face, leaving only fury and something else. Fear. I gathered the papers into a neat stack and slid them back toward my side of the table. "Leave," I said quietly, "and the next time you come knocking, you'll be speaking through my lawyer." For the first time since I had known him, Edward looked uncertain. He hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line, before snatching his coat from the chair and storming out the door. The silence that followed was vast, but it was no longer oppressive. It was mine. When the door closed behind Edward, the echo lingered in the hallway like a final punctuation mark. For the first time in weeks, I exhaled fully, as though I'd been holding my breath since the day my husband's voice rasped that strange command, "If you love me, never go into the cellar." I stood for a while in the quiet kitchen, my hands resting on the papers spread across the table. The house, once oppressive, felt lighter. The cellar below was no longer a tomb of secrets pressing against me. It was simply a room filled with hard truths, yes, but also a place I had claimed. That evening, I went down once more. Slowly, steadily, with the same brass key he had left behind, I descended into the cool air. The bulb flickered above me, casting pale light across the boxes and ledgers. But this time, I felt no fear, no humiliation, only ownership. I touched the notebooks, ran my hand across the rough cardboard boxes, and whispered into the dim space, "It's mine now. All of it." The secrets, the debts, the lies, they had once been his power over me. Now they were my proof, my weapon, my liberation. I locked the door again when I came up, but not because I feared it. I locked it because I chose to. Choice. What a small, simple thing, and yet how long it had been denied me. In the days that followed, I kept meeting with Margaret Huang. We organized, consolidated, defended what was mine. Some assets had to be sold, debts cleared, but the roof over my head remained secure, and the accounts that bore my name stayed in my possession. Edward, despite his bluster, went silent after the first letter from her office. Silence. His first true gift to me. I carried on with the ordinary tasks of life, grocery lists, laundry, phone calls with the children, but everything felt different, not because the tasks themselves had changed, but because I had. Once I thought age was a shrinking, fewer responsibilities, fewer choices, a steady slide into irrelevance, but I see now that age can also be an unveiling. All the years of endurance, the humiliation swallowed, the burdens carried. These do not make me small. They make me unshakable. Sometimes, when I walk past the cellar door, I still hear his voice, faint as a shadow. If you love me, never go in. And now I answer him in silence, my head held high. I did love him, fiercely, faithfully. But love is not obedience at all costs. Love is truth, even when it hurts. And truth, in the end, is what sets us free. Edward's words echo, too. You're not equipped for this. It's men's work. I smile now when I think of it, because I proved him wrong in the only way that mattered, not with shouting or violence, but with patience, knowledge, and the calm courage that comes from living long enough to know your own worth. I look in the mirror these days and see the lines on my face differently. They are not marks of decline, but of survival. Each one is proof that I endured, that I stood back up, that I am still here. To anyone listening, any woman who has been told she is too old, too weak, too ignorant to claim her place, hear me. Age is not a cage. It is not the end of your voice. Age is the moment the world underestimates you, and that is when you are most dangerous. We are never too old to face the dark, and we are never too weak to walk back into the light. That, I think, is the final lesson the cellar gave me.